People who are getting released from prison have so many things they have to deal with.
Sometimes it's like you wear it like an invisible coat, you know. You feel it and you wonder if anybody else can see it.
There is a punishment that people endure long, long after the sentence is over.
And it feels like you're never going to be whole again. You're never going to be a person, and you're not worthy of a place in society. And that kind of defeats the purpose of being released.
Initially, as we did reentry work, it was primarily focused on the barriers to employment. About 5 years ago, an area caught our attention that had literally gone unnoticed, unwritten about. One of the local community colleges in upstate New York that we had been referring students to had created an absolute bar to admissions, to the effect that if you have a felony conviction, you need not apply. Quite frankly, I doubted that that could be true. And I said, well, I'd like to see the policy. And sure enough, they came back to me with a written policy. And it was the first time that my eyes were open to the fact that there may be this much larger problem. It led us to look at the policies around New York State and then nationwide. What we found was that about 60% of all colleges engage in some sort of screening, sometimes with very little training. And it began us on this path of asking a lot of questions about what is this about? Could it really be about public safety and campus safety? Or were these counterproductive policies as we suspected? What's important for policymakers to understand is that if there is one thing that we know about, particularly about the criminal behavior of teenagers, is that the vast majority will be one-time offenders, one and done. Partly because they age out, mature out. What the American Bar Association has had to say about adolescent behavior is important, that the brain of a young person is different than that of an adult. It leads to higher risk-taking, a willingness to follow one's peers rather than some other social restrictions. It is that knowledge that's led our courts, and more recently the Supreme Court, to tell us that the behavior of teenagers is not predictive of future misconduct.
And the fact is that people who go through the process of getting into college after they come home from prison have shifted identity and have extremely low recidivism rates and higher graduation rates than their peers.
The truth is that the person who chooses to enroll in school after incarceration is the least likely person to commit a crime on campus. And we need to educate all school administrators about that.
If the driving force were to make our campuses safer by screening out certain students, perhaps a modest proposal that they might consider would be that perhaps we should only admit women to our colleges and universities, since their male counterparts offend at 3 times the rate that they do. Now, we wouldn't, of course, adopt that as a policy, but it does make one re-examine, is the goal simply to make college campuses safer, or do we need to look at the context in which this is happening?
As we think about people with criminal records, often folks in their minds think that this is some very small segment of the population, but the truth is that while the United States is only 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's prison population. There are over 100 million records on file with criminal justice repositories around the country.
The big trend that we should keep in mind is that starting in 1972, we have quadrupled the per capita rate of incarceration. Unprecedented in the history of the human race, unprecedented in our own national history. Now, that phenomenon is not equally distributed across the country. It has fallen most harshly on communities of color and is driven a lot by the increase in drug arrests.
What's often overlooked is the profound benefit that higher education institutions their students and their faculty receive when formerly incarcerated people enter an institution.
There's a big benefit to us to have people on our campus, in our classrooms, participating in our discussions, who bring into those discussions the personal experience of having been incarcerated.
These are the students who, given the support that every first-generation college student needs, who excel, not only in their academics, but also, and most importantly, in what they do when they leave. People who come into college from an experience of prison disproportionately participate in human services, community development, leadership, and public problem-solving fields.
I think admissions officers and counselors and faculty and student groups and the like, that we need an education of the education community to think about this particular population.
To bar people from access to education, access to higher education is, really fear-driven, unfortunately, not based on any sort of research or risk assessment.
For me, in an ideal world, the question, have you ever been convicted of a crime, would not be an appropriate question to have on an application to college.
Since there is no empirical evidence anywhere to support the notion that campus safety was improved by this screening process, the first and foremost of our recommendations would be that the question, have you ever been convicted of a crime, would be removed from the initial application completely. The second of our recommendations was that if a school is going to do this, they really need to do it in a transparent way. They need to train their staff, and they need to let applicants know exactly what the process is.